Here we are in Microsoft Excel. On the right hand side, we can see some data. This is ordinary sales data that we might find in an Excel spreadsheet or a sales database. We are looking for the sales amount column. So when we click on it, we see in our pivot table in the left hand side that we have the sales amount figure. Let's make it look better by making it into a currency. To do this, we format the cell, we leave it in the pennies, we add a pound sign and click OK. Now we can see the value of all of the sales. Let's add some more information to make the data more interesting. So we could add in some geography information, and let's look at the data by sales territory. We see that sales territory does not really align to country. When we add this in, we see we also have subtotals. Let's change the format of the table so that it appears in a more tabular format. Here we change the design of the table so it does not include subtotals and it appears in a tabular format. So now we have three columns: sales territory, region, sales territory, country, and the sales amount. This appears in a plain tabular format. How can we make this data appear more interesting? When we look at the data here, it's hard to get a sense of the comparisons between the data, for example. So let's put it in a very simple chart. To do this, we highlight the data, and we see that Microsoft Excel recommends some charts to us. Let's choose the first one that it recommends, which is a clustered column chart. Now this is actually quite hard to read. Let's make it bigger. We can see that the y-axis is actually still retained in the millions and also the pennies. That makes it a little bit harder to read. What we also notice is that the data on the x-axis is hard to read. We can see this example here. When we look at the bar, it's very hard to get a sense of the comparison of each of the regions against one another, since some appear almost to be at zero level. Also, the title is not very clear, it just simply says total. The actual title is in the top left hand side, sum of sales data. We have some chart junk here. We don't really need to know the pennies when the numbers actually are in millions. So why don't we see if there are different ways we can make this chart more interesting? Now we've just used the default Excel functionality. Now we could add in a background, or we could change the colours. Here the background has been changed, so it's gone from a light grey 3D to black. We can see here the numbers are still hard to read. This gives us hatched bars, and we can see that the y-axis information is hard to read because it's displayed horizontally rather than the normal format. The data also appears hatched. Here we have the y-axis and the value actually running into each other, and we can barely read the countries. Notice we haven't done anything to the Microsoft Excel workbook. we have simply used the default functionality that's available in Excel. What we see here is that the numbers can include each other. When we click on the bars, it gives us a number of options, and perhaps this might help us to make the information look better. We can't take any actions here, but what we could do is change the type. So let's change it to a pie chart and see how this looks. To make it more interesting, we will make it a 3D pie chart. A few things to notice here. We can see that it's quite difficult to compare. The grey slice closest to us actually looks larger than the blue slice at the back, even though the value of the blue slice at the back is larger. Also, the number on the right hand side highlighted here is actually smaller, but looks to be the same size as the value at the back. It's also very hard to distinguish the colours. They're all shades of blue, but it's quite hard for us to hold in our heads which colour matches which particular legend item. The colours are also quite difficult to distinguish. Perhaps we could make it look better by changing the 3D orientation. We can see here that the information is still displayed and it's slightly easier to read, but still the grey slice at the bottom still looks to be the same as the one at the back. Now we've changed the colours. It's still confusing to read because the greens suggest to us that those are the same metric or similar metrics, and they are a gradation of one particular metric, but it suggests that the blue and the yellow slices are something quite different. Again, we could also add in backgrounds to make it easier. In this default example, we've added in a background, which is also added in a background to the labels. When we reverse it and use black, it still looks quite confusing. So let's settle on the white one. This is slightly better because the colour of the label matches the colour of the slice, but we can see that there's a lot of unnecessary information there. For example, United Kingdom is labelled twice. We could put it back to a column chart, and what we could do instead of the default is actually use 3D. So let's use a 3D cluster chart. Now we have done that, the information is very difficult to read. We might argue that the green colour is better, but the 3D makes comparison very difficult. When we change the 3D angle slightly, we still have the same problems. The horizontal nature of the labels makes it very hard to read. How can we make these charts look better? What we will do is we will take this data and we will import it into Power BI. This will help us to make the charts look much clearer from the data visualization angle. So let's copy the data. Now I will start up Power BI Desktop. At the top on the Home tab, there is a label called Enter Data. So when we zoom in, we can see the panel. Now I'm just going to paste the data, and we can see that the column headers are automatically upgraded to headers. So that's good, that's what we want. We can see that the column headings in Excel match exactly what we have in Power BI. We can also rename the table I'm going to rename it to Internet Sales. And then I'll click on the Load button in order to load the data into Power BI. So let's take a look. At first we don't see any data. The data is loading into Power BI. When that's loaded, we will see the field names appear on the right hand side in the same way as they do in Excel. Excel also has the data on the right hand side. So we have the sum of sales amount, and we have the country and the region data as before. The sum has the sigma sign next to it, which tells us that it's a value. So let's click on the sum amount as we did before. We can see when the data is loaded that we get a chart this time rather than a number. This is because Power BI wants to visualize the data. And at over 29 million, it's the same value as before. So now when I click and tick, we start to get a chart. Now interestingly, what we have is a different colour for every region. The colours appear in the legend at the top from left to right, so this makes it easier for us to read. We can also increase the size of the font. Here we can do it on the x-axis. We will move it up to 10 points, and then it's easier to read now. We can do the same for the y-axis as well. So we increase the y-axis, and what you'll note this time is that we no longer have the long, full amount. Instead, we have it divided up into millions so that it's easier to read. What this does is it reduces the amount of chart junk on the page, since we don't need to process more information to get to the same result. It also affects the data ink ratio. Less ink is used on the Power BI workbook, but the same amount of data is shown. We can grasp that these figures on the y-axis actually represent millions, and we're not buried in the detail. We also have tooltips as well. Interestingly, Power BI allows us to filter, and it does a technique called brushing. Brushing the data means that you click and highlight one particular piece of information, and here we have highlighted some of the United States data. When we click back off it again, we get all of the data equally bright. So this chart is easier to read, and it's much nicer to lay out. We can actually add in slicers as well and filters in the same way as we can do in Excel. So all we need to do is move this chart to the right hand side. Then we'll add in a filter. Then we want to filter by region. So the filter appears on the left hand side, and we don't have to do anything here other than change the font. Then we can click and tick and we can filter. So we click on one segment and that's all that's shown to us. Then we can click back and we get all of the information. We could multi-select if we wanted. Let's add in a title of our own. We will call this title Internet Sales. Again, we can increase the font, and it looks much cleaner now. What we can do is duplicate this page by duplicating the tab at the bottom right hand side, and we can change this so it looks like a pie chart as we saw in Excel. To do this, we click on the chart, then we choose our visualization from the right hand side. Now this time we don't get a 3D chart. What we do get is a summary of a number of slices in the pie. The legends actually represents the regions, so when we add the two green slices together, that gives us the value for United States. So the use of colour here is to give us more information. If we click just on one slice, so now we are back to our pie chart. Now we don't have 3D in this pie chart, and it makes it simpler to read. The labels are nice and clean, and we can change the colours if we like. To do that, we click on the pie chart, we click on the paint roller, and we could change the colour of United States representation here. With that in mind, we can go back and look at our previous pie chart and our bar chart. When we look at the pie, we can see that the Power BI version is much cleaner. It doesn't have 3D, and it has a nicer look and feel. When we look back, we can see the pie chart in 3D does not look as clear as it does in Power BI. Even when we change it back to the clustered stacked column chart, we can see it's still harder to read in Excel. Now we have seen a comparison between default Excel functionality and Power BI. This helps to illustrate some of the differences between bad data visualization and good data visualization according to practice, science and art.